Hey guys, it's Jack. I just wanted to talk to you today about a way that you can help support the podcast if you're not already. To support the channel is to become a Patreon member. So we have Patreon memberships that start at just $5 a month. And when you sign up, you get access to all of our episodes ad free. That's the big bonus for that. I mean, we also do some Patreon bonus episodes for our subscribers. But this is the biggest and best way that you can support the Team House channel and podcast if you'd like to. And we really appreciate that. So go and check us out at patreon.com/the Team House.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Eyes On. I'm Andy Milburn.
Jason Lyons. And D is on. D is on, but he is muted right now.
Oh, yeah, he's got some maintenance guy in his home, so he's microphone off. Well, today, everyone, we have a very distinguished guest, Jim LaPorta. Okay, so because we are a kind of a bootstrap I wouldn't say organization, but not quite as smooth with our editing as the Team House. I know in the Team House they manage to bleep things just before they arrive, before they get in trouble, right? Even when doing it live. But Jim, jump in and embarrass me if I get anything about your background wrong. Okay, so Jim is an American investigative reporter who works now. You're working, it says in your bio, Rolling Stone, but that's not the case, right? You're with CBS.
Correct. Yeah, that's Wikipedia, which I don't know who creates Wikipedia pages, but yeah,
it's fascinating. Yeah. I thought you updated it, and I thought that's it. But the fact that someone goes to the trouble of updating your Wikipedia page says a lot about you, Jim. So let's not be too modest. In any case, if you are updating Jim's page, he works for CBS now.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
I was a contributing writer to Rolling Stone for a couple months. Yeah. So they're not entirely wrong.
And then now you're at CBS and you're working for the kind of the what's it called? Credibility? Is it
yeah, so our team,
explain what that is.
Sure, it's called the Confirm Team. It's actually a team.
Confirm Team, not Credibility.
Yeah,
but it's about credibility.
You're not wrong. I mean, that's basically what it is. The team started in March. We are the team is kind of made up of journalists who kind of come from all different walks of life. We have digital forensic journalists. We have journalists who do data. We have journalists who do visual investigations. We have journalists who do they're really good with court records. They're really good with the Freedom of Information Act, things like that. And what we do is we try to not only do we serve CBS News, we serve all of the CBS News affiliates around the country. So like I'm working on a story with like CBS News Philadelphia right now, or I might work with the CBS News affiliate in California, but then I might also work with 60 Minutes or 48 Hours. So we service all of CBS News in terms of like, we do geospatial location. We do if it's like Ukraine, if it's like Russia, Ukraine, I might jump in and try to identify ordnance and munitions, which would go into an investigative package for like say 60 Minutes. So we do a whole bunch of things.
Now, Jim, were you a plank owner on this team, or did you help start it, or was it already in place?
So it's a brand new idea. I think I was like either the first or second hire on the team. In terms of the team, I'm kind of the old man on the team because I've been in journalism for probably 11 years now. Nice. There's a good mix of journalists kind of like in the beginning of their career and kind of like, they got 5 or 6 years in. And then we have journalists who are, 10 to 15 years into their career. So there's a good mix. There's a good like mentorship, leadership, followership kind of dynamic going on. But I mean, some of the younger journalists, I learned from them, like especially like data journalists. Like I don't really do much data journalism in my day to day, and so they're whizzes because they can look at it's amazing. They can look at like just a big data set of numbers and find stories within the numbers, you know, and like trend lines and things like that, which is a skill set that I just don't naturally have.
Nice.
So,
This
but yeah, I think, you know, with the public kind of distrusting journalism, I think the more we can show our homework, the more we can show, be transparent.
Absolutely.
I think that builds credibility.
Yeah.
So the more, you know, instead of just like saying, hey, this is where we got this information, I'll show them the document of where the information comes from. So I always think more transparency is better, you know, in the world of disinformation.
Jim, that particular, what you're talking about is particularly interesting now, isn't it? In the recent, when I say in recent years, really in the last 2 years, there have been several high-profile cases of news that has broken and then is subsequently challenged or found out not to be the case, and then there's you know, reverberations and repercussions for those involved in the news cycle. You were personally involved, I know, in an instance like that. And then, you know, most recently we've had actually someone who I count as a friend, Jeffrey Gettleman of the New York Times, who wrote an article about the, you know, alleged rapes by Hamas in Israel, and the article caused a great deal of controversy about, you know, sourcing and whether it had been properly researched. So it's just kind of by way of context that gives enormous weight to what you are doing now, although you're typically playing it down as being quite modest. But
no,
it's going to be a huge learning experience too.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, the thing about journalism is, and look, there's a lot of criticism to go around in journalism, and I think that's, you know, it's fair. You know, people should be asking questions of how we do our work. But in journalism, we put our name on our stuff. You know, anything I've ever written, I put my name on it. And the moment I make a mistake, I have to own that mistake too. You know, so in journalism, if you're doing journalism the way it's supposed to be done, you own your mistakes. You know, you issue the corrections. You know, and we're also we're humans, so we're you know, we're all just kind of trying our best. You know, to you know, I you know, I don't know.
Well, I think to take a step back, I think it's worth mentioning that I probably missed out the most important part of your biography, and let's go back and emphasize it, that you were an infantry squad leader in Echo Company 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, which I believe is another Marine infantry battalion. I seem to have heard of it. It's over there on the East Coast, and they do okay, I guess. And
we're America's battalion.
Yeah, along with another 26, right?
Yeah,
in any case,
but so is there. But I think there's a battalion in 3rd Marine Regiment that's also America's battalion. So I don't know which one of us
that was
is actually the real.
What are you talking about? That was my battalion. No, it's in the 1-3. Yeah. It's 3-3. Yeah, 3-3 calls.
Oh, 3-3. That's right.
Battalion, that's right. But yeah, but I can tell you when I was at Camp Geiger as an infantry. An ITS student way back in '88, America's battalion was whatever battalion had most recently deployed to, God, I can't remember the Med. It was an 8th Marine Battalion. I remember. I want to say it was 1-8, but all over Camp Lejeune, everyone seemed to think 1-8 was America's battalion. So you missed that by one.
I mean,
but
you're
years
giving away
later,
a little
times changed.
more history. You're giving away some history because there are no infantry battalions on Camp Geiger anymore. Like Camp Geiger, as you know, is just a training command.
Yeah.
So you're really talking about
and
kind of the old.
And it's no longer ITS; it's the School of Infantry, and
that's right.
Times
it's the
change.
School of Infantry now.
But back to you. So you served in Afghanistan. You were actually in combat about 15 years ago, roughly, right? Around this time,
2009, and then 2013. But 2013, you know, one patrol hit an IED, so it wasn't as kinetic as 2009 was. You know, 2013, the Obama administration is really trying to end the war by 2014. And so it's a lot of, demil, there's certain areas in Afghanistan you just don't go into anymore just because there's no strategic value in going into it, because we're trying to hand everything off to the Afghans, but also trying to retrograde out of there. But obviously that didn't happen. But yeah, 2013 I was working mostly in intelligence. Whereas 2009, I was a saw gunner in a fire team, so it just vastly different experiences.
And as a brand new guy, were you given the saw?
Yeah.
That pisses me off so much. That is still going on too. That's the most common, is the hardest, the most important weapon in the infantry, Marine infantry rifle squad. And we always give it to the new guy.
I mean,
fucking heavy,
I've been in I got it. It's 22 pounds, fully loaded. I was in really good shape, probably like 300 pounds ago from what I am now. But I carried the saw on a 1-point sling. I loved in a firefight. Like I loved, it was I loved it. It only jammed once in a firefight, and it was probably my own fault because I didn't clean it.
Wow.
So I blame myself. Yeah, I had 100-round contact belt, and then had somewhere between 400 and 600 rounds that I'd carry on my body. Yeah.
Nice.
But
so
it's not.
So those of you who are tuning in going, wait a second, I thought this was current affairs, not some, more weapons point from the team house. I do want to add that what James is talking about is kind of the linchpin of the Marine Rifle Squad, the weapon that was the linchpin of the Marine Rifle Squad when we dumped the machine gun. As those of you who are fans of infantry combat, and why shouldn't you be, will be familiar with this constant struggle about automatic fire down at the lowest possible level. So so you started off as saw gunner, and how did it go on further? Tell us about your impressions. You were obviously, I am guessing, perhaps a cut above intelligence wise the average Marine infantryman. But I'd like to hear otherwise. I'd like to hear say no, actually.
Look, I learned some big words that make me sound smarter than I actually am, and some good officer phrases, and I might know a Clausewitz quote here or there that make me sound smarter than I am. But no, I went into the Marine Corps 10 days after I graduated high school. 9/11 was still on my mind, even going into 2005, 2006. Fallujah had already happened. Ramadi in Iraq had already happened. Went into the infantry. And then my first deployment was until 2009. So I was basically part of President Obama's kind of refocusing, shifting from the focus being on Iraq to shifting back to Afghanistan. So I was part of his initial surge of troops into, I was in Southern Helmand province. And so, so my first day in combat was July 2nd, 2009. It was the largest helo insertion for the Marine Corps since the Vietnam War. So we're basically 4,000 US Marines heloed into, we basically leapfrogged over the British and went into Southern Helmand and took over. And so that was kind of my first experiences. It was a very interesting time. Like I didn't, it was your first day of combat is kind of like, because I volunteered. I was actually at 2nd Marine Regiment, and my battalion had come over and asked for volunteers, and I hadn't been yet. So I was like, well, yeah, I'll go, and so, which was kind of nice because I didn't have to do any of the workup. I didn't do 29 palms. I didn't do any of that. They just like, go get your gear and we're going.
Nice.
Yeah. I skipped all the bad parts of getting ready for a deployment.
But a little scary too that we did that, right?
A little bit, but that was kind of the needs of, the Marine Corps, we're always sort of short on personnel. So I've never, for the 8 years that I was in, I've never been in a full TO'd infantry squad, which is 13 Marines, 3 fire teams and a squad leader. I've never been in that. you know, the squad that I joined, I think had a max of like 7, you know, so that's just kind of the way it was. The Marine Corps was always kind of like, who wants to go kind of, you know, they were always kind of like,
well, we were a little bit in danger of hollowing ourselves out during that time because we needed the force structure, right, to keep rotating battalions. And we were determined to keep battalion deployments to the 7 months. You know, those decisions were made way above you and I, but, you know, remember the regiments went for a year, but as you remember, whether it was Afghanistan, whether it was Helmand or Anbar, the Marine Corps stance was, look, you know, this is with the environment it is, blah, blah, blah. You know, 7 months is about right. And I think they're right on that. I really do. You know, but anyway, I'm sorry. Go
I mean, as a
ahead.
concept, it wasn't bad. It was, I mean, I don't know if they ever did achieve it, but the goal was 7 months deployed, a year off is, I think, the kind of the back and forth rotation they wanted.
The minimum.
And the only thing the Marine Corps didn't quite figure out, but I think this was a problem with all the services, was transitioning from the Marine Corps back into civilian life. Like, the goal was, we would like to give a Marine a year to transition. I've never met a Marine that got that year, you know, to kind of transition back into civilian life. You know, I think I had maybe a month or two to kind of like fully check out of the Marine Corps and figure out what I was going to do, you know, and get my resume ready and, you know, turn in gear and, you know, as you know, go around and get all these signatures from people that you've never met, you know, but yeah, no. So 2009 Afghanistan, rough deployment. We lost 14 Marines as a battalion. I think we were only there for about 4 months total. Cause the first month we were at mostly like Camp Leatherneck and Bastion. And then, we did spend some time in Kyrgyzstan, you know, before we actually rotated back home. And then from there, I re-enlisted, went down to Parris Island. I used to teach recruits how to shoot on the rifle range down at Parris Island. And then I heard 2-8 was going back to Afghanistan. So I volunteered a second time to go back to Afghanistan, and went back with my old company. So I rejoined Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, and went back in 2013. But this time I was working in intelligence, and so I was working in intelligence.
It's still an infantryman, but working within the company intelligence cell, which I believe was a Marine,
correct, yeah.
You know, kind of an innovation around 2007 or so.
Yeah, it was actually a really good program. You know, we weren't. Your intelligence cells at the company level are as good as you want to make it. You know, most are, you know, you can either have a really lazy one, which is just doing debriefs when guys come off of patrols. We didn't do that. We were like, look, we're going to do some things, you know? And so, I mean, we really tried to turn it into like a regional targeting cell. We modeled our intelligence cell off of the regimental targeting cell up at Leatherneck. And so we were actually trying to, like, we wanted a good, like, you know, intelligence preparation of the battlefield. So when the unit that was coming in to replace us, we had a good turnover with them. But we weren't just going to sit there and take debriefs. We actually wanted to get things done. So that was a good experience. And I say all that because when I was getting out in 2014, I was kind of like left to like, well, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I saw a lot of parallels between working in intelligence and working in journalism. I didn't initially know that. I originally got into journalism mostly because it wasn't the goal at first wasn't to like report the news. It was mostly like I had these war experiences that I wasn't ready to write about, and I wasn't really like ready to confront, you know? And so my thought was, well, maybe if I write about, you know, the war experiences of other veterans, through that, it'll be therapeutic for me in some way. So it was actually really a selfish reason. You know, I felt I wasn't ready to deal with my own stuff. So I'd write about other veterans.
Jim, can you talk a little bit about Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you have,
Yeah,
you've written a little bit about it too. The fact that,
I
as
have. It-
as General Nellis says, no one goes through combat and remains unchanged, and you've been very very honest about that.
Yeah, it took me a while to get to a place to start writing about some of my combat experiences and how they really impacted me, and changed me.
You
But
called
at
them
first,
the
I started.
monster, right? I
That's
just
right.
thought it was a
Yeah.
good term, the monster in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. Initially, I was writing about other veterans and their experiences, and that kind of backfired because I started to take on a lot of their trauma. So the first article that I ever wrote for the Washington Post was about a friend of mine who had taken his own life. And that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to write, and I actually didn't even know if I was going to be able to finish the article because I had to keep stopping, because I'd get, overwhelmed by writing about my friend who is no longer here. He overdosed on morphine and Klonopin and left a suicide note. That's the first article I ever wrote for the Washington Post. But through therapy and kind of getting better at translating my emotions onto, the blank page, it got better. So right after, I think it was a month after the Afghan withdrawal in August of 2021, I wrote about a 5-year-old kid who had stepped on an IED in 2013. What people don't know about that story is I started writing that 4 years prior, and I had to keep stopping. And mostly one of the hardest things I had with that article was I didn't know how to end it. And I didn't know how to end it until the Afghan war ended itself. And that's kind of how I felt with, there's a line in that article that I write about how wars don't end with a peace treaty. They don't end with a withdrawal or a retrograde. The wars ebb and flow in the memories of the people who were there. Right? I wrote something to that effect. And that's kind of how I felt. I was like, well, because the Afghanistan war is continuing on and on and on, year after year after year, I couldn't find an ending for how to write about this 5-year-old who stepped on an IED. So with the Afghan war ending, I was able to kind of put that memory. Not that I've kind of forgotten about that memory, but I was able to finally deal with that. This one memory from war, that I couldn't shake.
I was going to ask that question and you just answered it. If once you're done writing an article, do you find that catharsis, however you say it, do you find that the release helps you to put that aside for the next one, or do you hold on to a piece of everything you write?
I'm definitely a person who holds on to a piece of everything I write. For example, I almost quit journalism for good in October of 2018. I think it's either October 2018 or 2019. I'm pretty sure it's 2018. So I was sitting on my couch. A source calls me from Afghanistan, and they said, "Hey, we've had a green on blue shooting," which is, for people who might not know, it's when an Afghan soldier who were training, they kind of turn their weapon on American forces, and it's a betrayal, and so they'll kill an American service member. And so I covered several of these, and so I walk into my office, I start the pre-writing. Whenever there's an American service member killed, I kind of have a personal policy on two things. One, it's the only story that I don't get ahead of the Defense Department. I will because I know next to kin is happening. I know people are getting into uniforms and they're about to go break some family's heart permanently. So I know that's happening. So it's the one story, even though I know and I could publish, I don't want a family member reading about the death of a loved one before the Defense Department has had a chance to come tell them. Yeah. So I hold the story. The other policy that I have is I don't reach out to the family.
Mm.
The last thing they need right now is some reporter saying, how do you feel, when they've just had their life shattered. Now, if I do hear through other sources that they do want to talk about their family, I'll entertain that, and I'll put that into a story. But I try to leave the immediate family alone. There's other ways you can tell the story without bothering the family, who is probably overwhelmed at the moment. So I go into my office, I start the pre-writing, and about 30 minutes into my writing, the source hits me back and says, oh, by the way, he's got 7 kids. And the moment he said it, I lost it. I was, I mean, it's hard enough to, you're telling one kid that their loved one is not coming home, but how do you tell 7? That for some reason that really bothered me. So it was this guy named Major Brent Taylor from Utah. He was the mayor of his hometown. So he technically didn't even need to be in Afghanistan. He could have easily said, well, I'm the mayor, so I can't go on this deployment. But he went anyway. He was on his 4th deployment to Afghanistan, and his kids were all, I think his kids were all under the age of 10 or 11. Like, they're all very young. So now, I knew 2 guys in uniform were about to come tell this wife with 7 kids that their dad's not coming home. So I actually wrote a letter to Newsweek. I was working at Newsweek magazine at the time. I wrote a letter. I was going to resign. I just didn't want to do it anymore. And I was already thinking about, like, well, which journalists can I offload stories that I'm working on, and they can kind of take up the mantle. And so I was going to quit. And it's kind of weird. It was actually the source who informed me about the Green on Blue shooting who gave me some advice. They were like, if you don't tell their stories, who's going to? And that's kind of the reason I'm still in journalism today. But I really wanted to quit at that time, because journalism, it was no longer fun is not the right word, but I was no longer getting anything out of it. It was hurting more than it was helping. But that's why I'm still in journalism today. I don't know. I didn't mean to turn this into a therapy session.
Appreciate it. No.
Yeah, Jay,
but you saying do story with me? Yeah, they do. Like, they really, like, I can still get emotional about thinking about it.
I just a couple of thoughts, Jim. I didn't mean to hang you out there, but I think for a lot of us, once sometimes the hardest part is, I know this sounds like a cliche, but the hardest part is after combat for a number of reasons. And one of which is, as we get older and have kids, it puts things in context when we see things that have happened. At the time it was, but it's tragic, it's horrible, but if you're barely a kid yourself, it's not as horrible as when you're a father looking back on things that we had seen, right? That's number one. Number two, you can sustain yourself when there's a feeling that you just have right on your side. As trite that though may sound, that counts for a huge amount. I see in Ukraine, my experience there, the scale of suffering is off the charts from anything we have seen or experienced in combat. And yet their morale has remained really high. And why is that? Even though they face the prospect of, not certain death, but probable death, it's simply because they have absolute 100% belief in their cause, and their country does too. And we just didn't have that. And I think that, we didn't have it. People can say, hey, we support you. But the bottom line is we didn't have it because we had a war that dragged on for 2 decades to no end, right? So I think all of those things.
Well, that was what was very frustrating. I remember that was kind of what was very frustrating, to jump back on the topic of Afghanistan. I remember when the Afghanistan papers came out in the Washington Post, right? And civilians were like, finally, we know the truth that the war in Afghanistan is not going well. And I remember talking to a lot of veterans where I'm like, you could have talked to a lance corporal or a young lieutenant or captain at any point in in the Afghanistan war, and they would have been very honest with you about, look, they might be saying we're turning a corner and making progress from the Pentagon podium. That's not what's happening down here. No. Like there was just a disconnect between Washington and the infantry grunt on the ground. And here's the thing, the infantry grunts were not like holding this back. Like if you, all you had to do was walk up and ask them.
And they weren't even bitter. They weren't even bitter about it.
They were just
it was
telling
part
them.
of it was part of a joke.
That's right.
It was part of this big joke. It was.
That's right. It became the joke. That's right.
Here we are again.
So I got very frustrated, you know, with when the Afghanistan papers came out. I was like, yeah, this is. And by the way, the Afghanistan papers. Okay, there's some echoes to the Pentagon papers in Vietnam, but all you had to do was go over to and read the reports at the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, and they would have told you the same. Like these weren't. The problems in Afghanistan weren't this, you know, hidden behind classification. Like they were in view of the public for them to read at any point, you know. And so I remember a lot of veterans being very frustrated when those Afghanistan papers came out, and people were like, well, finally we know. It's like, no, we've known for a while. The question is, was anyone paying attention? Yeah. That's where the real question is, you know. No, you know, talking about Ukraine, I have a buddy of mine who literally just called me yesterday. We started in Afghanistan together in 2009. He's a Marine sniper, and you know, he's 39. He's going on 40, and you know, he's talking to me about how, you know, look, I'm in a dead end job. I don't really have a purpose in life. I don't have a wife. I don't have a kid, but I really believe in Ukraine's cause, and I'm going to go over and fight. And he was asking me for my advice. And, you know, I told him, I was like, because I've reported on the Russia-Ukraine war. So I was kind of telling them, here's the realities. Like, you know, what Ukraine is going through is not what, it's a fight I wouldn't want to be in. Like what I had to go through in Afghanistan, I didn't have to deal with drones. I didn't have to deal with mechanized units. I didn't have to, trench warfare was not a thing in Helmand province. You know, so
air
attack,
the scale of artillery. Yeah.
I mean, and so I was telling him, I told him, I was like, look, I'm not going to tell you what to do. It's your life. But I told him I was worried for him, you know, and he says, you know, do you think the war is going to end? And I was like, it doesn't seem like it right now. And especially when we're going into a new administration where there's a possibility that, you know, military aid to Ukraine might get cut off. And what if that happens? What if the U.S. stops shipping HIMARS and ATACMS and, you know, bullets and bombs and mortars to Ukraine? What happens then? I don't know. So I told him, I was like, you're joining the Foreign Legion at a really interesting time in the Russia-Ukraine war. You know, so I don't know. It's I'm
always adamant,
you know, because I don't want to write his obituary.
Yeah,
you know, that's my fear is I don't want to have to write your obituary.
I always tell people, no, don't do it. Don't do it. You know, I mean, the Ukrainians are struggling for manpower. They've had 600,000 to 700,000 military-age males leave the country, you know, to avoid service. And it just doesn't seem to make sense that people are filling this void with their own bodies to no end. You know, I think all of us who've known people who volunteered have seen the incredibly high attrition rate among them. And I just, you're right. It's beyond the scale of imagination, I think, for a lot of veterans. But I think there's another aspect of this, Jim, too, from the veterans I've spoken to who've either served in Ukraine or on their way want to, and that is a sense of what I just talked about, kind of the clarity of the cause, which they have missed. They wanted, but they have missed throughout their careers, you know, and now they have it.
Right. And that's the sentiment I got from him. He's like, look, I don't have a purpose right now. And that's kind of what that was kind of his driving force in wanting to join was, in terms of protecting Ukrainian sovereignty, you know, and Russia's violation of that. But you know, I didn't hold back on the realities of what warfare is like in Ukraine. I mean, I was telling him, I was like, it's not Afghanistan, you know. The tactics you applied in Afghanistan, I don't know if they translate to a Ukraine. I would imagine they would.
Yeah, it's very different.
There's things that you have to consider the things you have to consider that we just didn't have to deal with. Like I never had to fight a tank.
Yeah.
So you know, like I laugh about it because it's crazy. Yeah, because I've never had to fight a tank. You know, but I remember when Crimea was annexed, a buddy of mine who's an Air Force Special Operations pilot, Nolan Peterson, who's covered Ukraine for a long time.
I've met him. I had dinner with him in Kiev actually.
He was one of my first editors when I first got into journalism.
Yes, with
wasn't he
with Black Rifle Coffee for a while?
For a while, yeah. He's a phenomenal writer. Like his writing is beautiful. I wish I could write like him because he can just throw out 1,000 words like it's nobody's business, and you know it all is, you know, beautiful. Whereas I take my time. But he was there in Crimea, and I remember him sending me pictures after, you know, back from Ukraine in Mariupol, and it was like right after a tank battle. And it looked like I was looking at pictures from like World War II. It was just hard to imagine, you know, a modern day tank battle, you know, in 2014. You know, I was like, what is this, World War II? He's like, no, this was like 2 days ago. You know, it was just kind of crazy. So jump to, you know, the invasion, you know, and you have tank battles between Abrams tanks and, you know, and you know, T-72s and, you know, Leopolds and stuff like that. It's just as an observer, it's crazy to watch.
It's like nothing we expected to see.
Yeah.
Jim, so you went from so you're saying it's kind of the bit of a stretch, perhaps, but your time in the intelligence cell kind of got you interested, or perhaps launched you on trajectory to be an investigative journalist. And so what? You know, what are some of the? I'm trying to avoid being, you know, too specific, but if you could just talk about some of the formative experiences that you've had about investigative journalists, and I don't mean necessarily just the AP thing, but I hope I'm kind of leading you here. You know, whatever. I mean, your battles with the Marine Corps, or you know, you name it. It's not a. I mean, it's kind of a. It's not an easy path, I guess, is it, within journalism? Certainly.
No. You know, not to sound like a bumper sticker, but I do believe in the old school basic tenets of journalism, that journalism is there to be the fourth estate. We're there to be a check on power. You know, you're supposed to hold people in power accountable. You're supposed to give voice to the voiceless. I still believe all that. The idealist in me, and holding the Marine Corps accountable is part of the job. And the Marine Corps sometimes wants blind loyalty, and you know, I think they've gotten better at it, I will say, to give them credit. But back in, you know, 2017, 2018. Their approach was, the problem isn't the problem. The problem is that you're pointing out the problem. Like that was their, you know, and it was one of those kind of, you know, approaches, and which is ridiculous, you know. And so early in my career, there was a period of where I think the Marine Corps viewed me as a bitter Marine. And I had long conversations with public affairs officers saying, I'm not bitter at all. I'm very proud of my service. I'm proud to be a Marine. And I criticized the Marine Corps out of a place of, I want it to be a better organization. Not that I'm trying to tear it down, you know. But that was kind of their stance. Like they, you know, they didn't want any sort of public scrutiny at all. I will say they've gotten better in some respects, but I'm also kind of out of the loop a little bit. I don't cover the Marine Corps on a day-to-day basis, or even the military services on a day-to-day basis. Even though I still do military stories, but I mean, it was very frustrating.
Can you? Because I remember specifically you were barred from coming on base, and it was kind of interesting because you were still a reservist, right? But you were covering a sexual assault story that was particularly sensitive to the command.
Yeah. So the issue there was a woman on base who was allegedly sexually assaulted, and she said she had two things going. She said, one, she had a strong mistrust of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and she had a strong mistrust of Camp Lejeune Public Affairs. I had base access.
Sorry, when you mentioned both those two organizations, I mean, who could possibly distrust those two?
Right. And so that was the kind of situation. I had base access, but I was also invited on base. But I also knew if I put public affairs, if I went through public affairs and said, I want to interview this woman, one, they would have said no. And two, even if they had said yes, it would have tainted the interview process. It wouldn't have been as forthcoming, And so I went around public affairs, and public affairs didn't like that. Public affairs was they said, well, the policy is you have to come through us. That's not a policy. There's no policy that says me as an independent journalist, I can't go and call up anyone I want to. The policy is for the service members. They're supposed to say, I refer you to public affairs. But this idea that I have to go through public affairs that's just not true.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, I will say though that getting banned from Camp Lejeune, I thought there was even some Marine Corps public affairs officers who thought that was too heavy-handed by Camp Lejeune. Like, I agree. Like, I was honorably discharged. I served there for 6 of my 8 years. Never had a disciplinary issue. I've never been JP'd, never been court-martialed. I think the letter says I was a security risk, which is ridiculous.
you were following a legitimate line of inquiry.
Correct.
That didn't impact on national security. Couldn't possibly impact on national security.
Correct. Yeah. I conducted myself, even as a reporter, I conducted myself as a Marine.
I mean, it was just it was a very cack-handed, very clumsy move by whichever commanding officer was involved in that decision. One expects public affairs people often to give bad advice because they're junior, and it's an MOS that, the average, you don't really join the Marine Corps to be a public affairs guy unless you had planned subsequently to run for vice president. But no, I'm kidding. As an officer, though, Jason, I don't think it's fair to say that we perhaps don't have our best people in public affairs, right?
It doesn't normally turn out that way.
And it backfires on us as an organization again and again. Jim has kind of an insider track when he writes about the Marine Corps, so he's got that part of him that feels a familial responsibility. So he isn't a muckraker. Yeah. But I can tell you there are others, so I've talked to correspondents, BBC, especially foreign correspondents, who think that we are abysmal when it comes to public relations. Not just the Marine Corps, to be fair, but the U.S. military.
There are some public affairs officers who generally want to do a good job, and they're really, because I talked to a lot of them off the record and on background, and I asked them, like, what are the struggles in your job, so I can try to understand. As a journalist, I don't want an adversarial, relationship, and a lot of the public affairs officers tell me they're caught in the middle. At one point, So
Yeah.
one, they have to buy in. They have to get buy-in from the commanding officer, and commanding officers are reluctant to talk to the press. The other, but the real people that they have to deal with, and why a lot of public affairs officers kind of get thrown under the bus, is actually the lawyers. It's the lawyers who are dictating, like, don't put this information out, don't put that information out. And unfortunately, the public affairs officers usually take the brunt of the criticism. But it's a lot of the times like they're having to navigate this world of, you know, what can we say legally,
Yeah.
you know, and
Without getting
also trying to
beaten
get
up. Yeah.
commanding officer. Like,
Which
so
is
one of the
why we
things-
should be putting really good guys in there. To go on.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, I mean,
Well,
it's
one of
it's a
the things
tough path.
I was talking to a colleague over at military.com who's also an Army veteran. And so every year there's a conference called the Military Reporters and Editors Conference. And there is a Q&A session that I really love. So the heads of public affairs for every one of the services come. And there's a Q&A session between the journalists and the head of public affairs for every service every year at Military Reporters and Editors. It's usually held in Washington, D.C. at the Navy Yard. And the question I'm going to bring up this year that I want an answer to is, if you type in the word loss of trust and confidence, if you type that phrase into Google, you're gonna have hundreds of articles pop up about this commanding officer was relieved for a loss of trust and confidence. This person was relieved for a loss of trust and confidence. My issue with that is loss of trust and confidence can be a whole bunch of things, right? It can run from you slept with someone's wife to you're a bad leader, and you haven't fostered a good command climate. And there has to be a way, a better balancing act, where the American people are better informed of why the skipper of a submarine was relieved, because loss of trust and confidence doesn't do it. There has to be a balancing act where you're protecting someone's rights if there's an ongoing investigation, but you're also giving a little bit more to the American people that isn't just this vague umbrella phrase that means nothing.
Yeah, because I don't want to see an article lead that says loss of trust and confidence and submarine in the same line, because now I'm thinking, did he sleep with someone's wife or did he launch freaking nuclear weapons? You know, tell me.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's
Actually, there's a British submarine commander who just crossed the line on both those things. He made a porno video on his submarine. Yeah.
Oh boy.
No, but I don't mean to keep that. Hold it. Let me check the dog real quick.
Go ahead. Tell him we said hi.
But yeah, no, I mean, no, but that's the exact point. Like, there has to be a middle ground to where, because usually what's happening is when there's a commanding officer is relieved, there is usually an ongoing investigation. So there has to be a way of like protecting that ongoing investigation and the commanding officer's rights, but also, you know, like giving a little bit more to the American people where we're not assuming the absolute worst.
Absolutely. Because the average American person, reader is just going to see those two things, you know, loss of trust and confidence, nuclear submarine, or, you know, if it happened in a combat zone, you know, did he massacre a village or did he just, you know, was he just an ass, you know, to his Marines? Give us something.
Yeah, this has been a bugaboo for me for a long time, because within the military too, there's good reason to be less opaque. You know, if we're nurturing leaders and we're saying that, you know, everything we do is focused on teaching people to lead, then they need this information. If we're at the same time firing a whole bunch of people we've selected to lead, then what is going wrong? All right. And it's particularly troublesome. I mean, it's troublesome in all the services. I would say when you look at the number of firings per year, and you look at the command selection process, we shouldn't be firing this many people, especially the Navy, especially in the Navy service. You know, if you looked at the statistics there, I have not, but I suspect they're really high. Something is wrong. And so we do need to be less opaque. Certainly, you know, if nothing else, yes, for the whole freedom of information intent, but secondly, to become better organizations. I mean, organizations defending democracy, supposed to be transparent. How do we improve if every time someone does something? And there is a massive difference between you know, there's like extreme, there's negligent incompetence, all right? There's simple
Right.
sustained incompetence, right? Both those things are enough to get you relief, but negligent incompetence is kind of a one-off thing, whereas sustained incompetence is a pattern. But then there is egregious personal behavior, which can run the gamut from, and I'm not playing down anything, but from things that are not a crime in civilian life, like adultery, all the way through to things that we were talking about before the show, like, you know, child pedophilia. It's not, we weren't talking about pedophilia, we're talking about officer misconduct, and pedophilia was something that,
we you know, the other thing on that topic there, so commanding officers, and you'll know this, is so there's this concept of they're called CCIRs, which are commanders critical intelligence requirements. Basically, these are, if something happens, I need to know this right away, you know, and whatever they are. And I can't tell you how many units that I've come across where their top, a commander's top criteria, number one, is will this garner media attention? And that really bothers me, because you would assume it should be the moment.
What's the seriousness?
Unit, the moment a service member dies in my unit, why isn't that number one? Why is it if it will garner media attention? You know, like, why is that your number one concern? Why is your number one concern not the personnel in your military unit? Why is it that it might end up on Fox News or CBS News or something like why is that your concern? That should be the least of your concerns. Taking care of your people should. But time and time again, I've seen, I've gotten through the Freedom of Information Act, a commander's CCIRs, and the top one is the media. And I'm like, why are you so concerned with the media? Be concerned with what your unit's doing, or at least that it seems like that should be what you should be concerned with.
But finding out the truth. I think, that's a really interesting comment. I think it honestly goes hand in hand with this cult of anti-intellectualism that exists within the military. It's kind of, you know, beneath the surface, but it's always been there. Officers bragging about having athletic scholarships and never studying, never having read a book. You know, there's kind of this macho bravado that goes hand in hand with eschewing anything that deals with the intellect. Now, as an extension of that, though, I think there's the hangover from Vietnam, and there's this very reflexively kind of feeling that the media is the enemy, and the media there is to expose all your secrets. And it saddens me because we really don't do a good job of inculcating, certainly not when I was an officer, the fact that watchdog of democracy is more than just, you know, a banal title. It's exactly what we make of it. And it is the responsibility of everyone, not just those within journalism, to ensure that it remains the watchdog of democracy. And if you're not being honest with it, it cannot do so. And by the way, we too represented democracy. So we should be all working for the same thing.
I mean, you make a good point. You know, I think Vietnam was a big lesson for the U.S. military, especially as they went into the Bosnian wars. You know, the U.S. military, journalists had unfeathered access, you know, and so what they typically did was they'd go to what were called the 5 o'clock follies in Saigon, and they would get basically the daily Pentagon briefing. And then they'd go out to the field where the grunts were, and would learn that what was in the Pentagon briefing was not, it kind of like Afghanistan, what was being said in the Pentagon briefing was not what was happening on the ground. And so that became the report. Moving into the first Gulf War and then to the Bosnian wars, media access was pulled. And so you didn't have journalists getting the same type of access that they had in Vietnam. And it was for that very reason, so that a news report wouldn't undercut the messaging of the Defense Department. And then they sort of kind of opened it back up for Iraq, you know, when you had journalists embedding with Iraqi units, or excuse me, with American units in Iraq. And then it started to get pulled back again, you know, like, so it was like, it's really interesting to kind of, you know, to watch kind of the ebbs and flows of media access when it comes to the military. Like, the one thing I was very kind of upset about was as we were moving into the Afghan withdrawal, things that journalists used to get all the time started to get classified. And for example, throughout the Afghanistan war, we used to commonly get contested area reports in terms of like what areas did the Afghan government control versus what areas the Taliban controlled. Those were now classified, and they were tied to, well, there's ongoing negotiations between the United States and the Taliban. So we no longer got contested area reports. We used to get reports about the troop strength for the Afghan National Security Forces and how many casualties they were taking. Those were now classified and tied to the ongoing negotiations. We used to get, how many shorties were being flown, how much. So all these things that were historically given to journalists to give us sort of an intelligence picture of what was going on the ground in Afghanistan, were now all classified. And I know of stories where Afghans have been killed like 30 a day, 40 a day. And those firefights never got into the news because they were now classified.
This
And
was
it all
during
tied
when
to-
did this start happening, Jim? When did they start getting classified? Roughly.
So it was right around when we first started negotiating the Doha agreements. So 2017, 2019. So the Doha agreement is signed in 2020 on February 29th, 2020. So I don't want to say the Trump administration, but it is. It's so during the Trump administration, a lot of the things that we historically used to get so we could kind of gauge what was happening in Afghanistan were now all tied to the negotiations. And so the American people kind of lost what was happening on the ground. And therefore you could argue lost interest, because they were
just at a time when things took a steep trajectory, or started to take a steep trajectory down.
And it was becoming very hard. It was becoming very hard to report on what was happening on the ground. And I'll give you an example. When I was at Newsweek, I started to heavily cover the Green Berets and what they were doing on the ground. And they were taking casualties left and right. Guys were losing arms and legs. And it was almost like it was like an earlier part of the war. But this is like 2018, 2019. And I'd go to the Pentagon and I'd ask them for the casualty reports. And they would say, well, the Privacy Act. And I'm like, well, look, I'm not asking for names. I'm not trying to identify people. I understand that these guys are special forces, but I also know you guys are taking casualties. And I just couldn't get anything out of the Pentagon. So the workaround was I started talking to the wives. I started talking to girlfriends. And who wanted the information out there that my husband just lost his legs, but they were taking heavy casualties. And at that point, and because the goal was what the special forces were trying to do at that time was, which was kind of reminiscent of Vietnam, which was we need to rack up the body count so we can use it as like a bargaining chip in the Doha negotiations. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what they were trying to do. But the risk to that was you were sending special forces out on missions that you could argue they didn't need to be out on. And guys were losing arms and legs left and right. But it was in this sort of strategy of like, we need to rack up the body count to use it as a bargaining chip with the Taliban, which the Taliban were never going to, it
wouldn't have mattered.
The Taliban's
always
never been concerned about their body count.
We always assume it has a larger effect on the enemy.
Yeah.
Because it has an effect on us.
You're right, but it was very reminiscent of McNamara. Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense during Vietnam, like he was very much a numbers guy, and he had this false equivalency of like, well, if we've killed this many a day, then that equates to success, which is
battlefield
just
calculus.
Ridiculous. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, and the difference between what you went through and the McNamara era was they would put those numbers right on the news. That was like one of the first things they would report on. Was the body.
You're right. McNamara wanted these big boards with all the numbers.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. But you make a good point. He wanted them out there of like, well, see, we've killed this many today, and that equates to success.
Yeah.
Where you're right. In this context, they just wanted the Taliban to know.
Yeah.
But again, the Taliban's never been concerned about taking casualties,
Yeah.
especially when there's, their belief is that, you're invading our land, So.
Jim, as a journalist,
This has been really, it's been a really good conversation.
Well, no, this has been terrific. There's so much more to talk about. Don't worry, listeners. We're not gonna make this a 2-hour episode and rival the Team House. But I wanted to ask you, what are some of the things that you are most proud of as a journalist over the last few years?
So the stories that I'm most proud of are not the stories that I'm kind of known for, if that makes sense. Like the biggest stories in my career have been like, I was the first reporter to break the news that Special Forces had killed al-Baghdadi. So that was
How did you do that, by the way?
A source called me on my day off and said, "Stay by your phone." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And he was like, "Hey, we've killed Baghdadi, but that was another story that I held because there was a security concern. So I could have published way before I did. My concern there is that the mission was still the operators were still on the X. They were still there.
Yeah.
And I was waiting for them to leave before I published anything.
Wow. It was
so
that long.
So it was until I got confirmation that they were gone. I was like, well, we're not going to publish,
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a crazy night.
Wow.
I was in, but yeah, I got a call, keep your phone on kind of thing. But yeah, the stories that I mostly care about are not stories that are the big stories. Like the story I care about, a recent story I care about is last year I completed a 5-year investigation into the USS Boxer, and they did in their 2016 deployment. Basically what was happening is I had gotten a tip 5 years earlier that there was a bunch of service members who were on the Boxer, and somehow their water supply was contaminated with fuel on the Boxer. And so for weeks on end, you had Marines and sailors drinking this water, bathing in it,
I know all
things
about
like that.
Oh my God, yeah, that's familiar.
And so what was happening was a lot of these service members were now veterans, and they were trying to get covered by the VA. But the problem was there was no documentation of it. And so the VA was kind of like, well, I'm sorry, we can't cover you. There's literally no documentation that this event ever happened. And so I spent the next 5 years I submitted tons of Freedom of Information Act requests looking for documents. I didn't find not one document through the Freedom of Information Act. Apparently the documents were deleted for whatever reason. I was looking for at least, an email that said there's fuel in the water, something like that. Yeah. And I couldn't find anything. And then I stumbled upon sort of a key break in the story was I found so you guys might remember, you know how like at the end of a deployment, you might have like a yearbook, like a cruise book that comes out.
Yep.
So I found the company that produced their 2016 yearbook, and they just had extra copies. So I just bought one, which then I started like, oh, well, now I know who exactly was on the ship for that deployment. So I started just interviewing key members of the ship, someone who worked in the oil lab. And I basically found out how it all happened. What happened was they were off the coast of Japan. There was a chief petty officer who had, and by the way, I should say he denies that this happened, but 3 individuals I talked to from the oil lab, including an officer, said that, he ordered that for oil to be dumped off the starboard side. The problem is that the oil lab didn't coordinate with the bridge, And so when you're dumping fuel, which by the way, you're not supposed to,
Mhm.
unless it's in an emergency situation, but when you're dumping fuel, you have to keep the ship moving,
Mhm.
right? Well, the problem is the ship stopped. So as you're dumping fuel off the starboard side, the evaporators are sucking in fresh water on the port side. So they're basically sucking in their own fuel, which contaminated the water supply. The other issue there is you can't then just dump that water, because water is used to literally like balance the ship. You know, the tanks are used as to keep the ship on an even keel. So, and the only way you can do it to clean the tanks is the ship has to go into port, and it all has to be hand carried out, and then the tanks have to be scrubbed. And by the way, these tanks are like 20 feet down. You're like, I mean, they're huge tanks.
Yeah.
But they didn't do that till like 2 months later. So for 2 months, the water was basically contaminated.
Yeah.
And I finally found a recon corpsman. I found a Navy corpsman who was part of a recon platoon. And when the email went out to tell the ship that there was fuel in the water, he was like, he had the foresight to print that email out and stick it into the medical jackets of each one of his Marines. He was being a really good corpsman.
Wow.
So that they could be covered. I interviewed him, and he had a copy of it. And that is like the one document that I was looking for. That I had spent years looking for. He just happened to have it. But that only covered like 30, it only covered his guys. The whole ship wasn't covered. And so I put out my story. Boxer veterans are now able to get coverage under the VA who were exposed to that contaminated water because of that one document that showed that there was fuel in the water.
Okay. God bless you, Jim, for doing. Can you imagine
I mean,
how many?
Like
and that's one ship. That's one ship
that's one ship.
You know, they were fortunate. They were fortunate enough that, you know, that the universe hit Jim LaPorta on this one point, because we've all tasted gasoline. I mean, I remember being on the Tripoli, and it was a joke. People stank of it coming out of the showers, and you know, and you used to dump Kool-Aid in your water.
Yeah.
And you know, but the Navy has probably made a tradition of that kind of fuck up. Countless generations of Marines.
There's 2 points about that. There's 2 points about that. One is there's a Navy policy that says 0 fuel can be in the water. And 2, Navy ships to this day do not have a way to test if there's fuel in the water. That was the other thing that our investigation found. And the Navy admitted that. They don't. So when there is fuel in the water, the only way to test it is they have to send that water out to a lab and then wait for the results. They don't have a way to test if there's fuel in the water on the ship. Like, which is
crazy.
Kind of crazy. Like you think like even sound real. Like what do you mean they can't test for fuel in the water? Like it's a modern day Navy. No, they don't have. So that was kind of eye opening that
they can stop incoming hypersonic missiles, but they don't have.
But we can't test for fuel in the water. Right.
There's shit in the water gauge.
Yeah. So when you ask me about
that's an amazing story
like that do some good. That, you know, where people can find some sort of benefit from them. And it's not just the, you know, the day-to-day of, you know, this person said this, which is crazy, and this person said this, and that's crazy, and that's the news article, you know. Like I do prefer articles that people can benefit from in some way.
Awesome.
Jim, this has been terrific.
Yes.
And we have to bring you on again. Your chain of command permitting. You did mention though that your bosses at CBS were very good, very benevolent. And I saw your face. You looked very concerned there for a moment. So we should be able to get you get back on. This has been terrific, and
it took some time
stuff to talk about
because
we'd love to get your insights on some of the things we're discussing too, especially I mean, if I see you pop up on Twitter with some great insight, don't be surprised if I reach out and say, "Hey Jim, do you mind jumping on?"
No, absolutely. I'd love to come back.
So see if you can get a blanket agreement.
I can do that. Actually, I could do that. Like that's not a bad idea.
We could. We're legit.
Awesome.
I mean, there's no shortage of military news today.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm sure a large number of our audience, a large percentage of our audience are military, former military, but everyone seems to have an interest in it.
Yeah.
All right. D, over to you. No, hey, Jim, it's been awesome. And
yeah, Jim, that was great.
I'll have you back.
Don't forget to look up Jim on Twitter and everywhere he's at. It's at James LaPorta on Twitter.
Jim LaPorta. Yeah.
Jim LaPorta on Twitter. Of course, Andy Milburn on Twitter and everywhere else. All the links will be in the description down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and patreon.com/theteamhouse. Help us out. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Cool. See you next week.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.